5,000 years ago, someone walked into a building in the mountains of Uruk, set down a piece of gold and never came back for it. The gold just sat there for 50 centuries. Think about that for a second. Whole empires rose and fell above it. Babylon, Assyria, Rome, the Ottomans, modern Iraq. None of them had any idea the building was down there. None of them knew the gold was waiting. Then, in September of 2025, a team of archaeologists in the Zagros foothills started digging into what they thought was just another ordinary layer of dirt. And they hit a wall. Not just any wall, a temple wall. And it was decorated in a style that has no business being in these mountains. A style that was invented 480 kilometres to the south, in the world's very first city. Pressed into the plaster were thousands of tiny painted cones, arranged in the exact geometric patterns you'd see in the great sanctuaries of Uruk, and right there in the debris they found the gold pendant. Next to it, a cylinder seal, basically the ancient equivalent of an official ID badge, belonging to someone with real power inside a network that spanned the ancient world. So who built this temple? Who left the gold behind? And of all the places in the world, why here, on this quiet hillside 2 weeks' walk from anywhere that mattered? Drive about 23 kilometres west of the modern city of Sulaymaniyah, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and you will pass through a landscape that does not look like the country most outsiders picture when they think of Iraq. There is no flat desert here. There is no horizon of empty heat. The land rises and folds. Limestone ridges break out of the soil. Streams run cold from the mountains in the spring. Wheat and barley grow in the small valleys between the hills. Goats find their way along terraces that seem to belong more to a Greek island than to the western edge of Asia. This is the Basian Basin, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, where the Great Range begins to climb out of the Mesopotamian plain and continue eastward toward Iran. In one of those small valleys, on a piece of slightly rising ground, there is a mound. From a distance, it does not look like much. It covers about 3 hectares in total area, with a main mound roughly 75 metres in diameter at its base, rising to a height of approximately 15 metres. To the eye of a passing traveller, it could be mistaken for a low hill, or a piece of agricultural earth piled up over generations. To anyone trained to read the landscape, however, it is unmistakable. The shape is too regular. The slope is too even. The vegetation grows differently on it than on the natural ground around it. This is a tell, an artificial hill formed by thousands of years of human settlement, built up out of broken mud brick walls and collapsed roofs and trampled floors and discarded pottery and the slow, patient layering of human life. Inside this mound, 15 metres of accumulated past are sleeping. That number deserves a moment of attention, because the human imagination tends to fail when it tries to picture deep time. 15 metres of soil in a place like this contains thousands of years of human occupation. According to the team's own published radiocarbon work, the main occupation of Kanish spans roughly 5,000 to 2,500 years before Christ. That is, the Chalcolithic period through the early Bronze Age. People were already living here in the late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic periods, before the wheel, before writing, before the first cities. The deeper levels of the mound contain modest traces of Halaf and Ubaid period activity. The site reached its peak during the late Chalcolithic and Uruk periods. It continued in use through the early dynastic period, when the first kings inscribed their names on stone, and much later, the lower towns saw additional activity in the Neo-Assyrian, Hellenistic, Parthian and Islamic periods. With an Ottoman cemetery in its more recent history, every era that touched this corner of the world left something on this mound. The wind brought a little soil, a wall fell over and was buried, a fire turned a roof to ash, a grave was dug and filled, and the layers built up one over the other like a single book whose pages were pressed flat by the weight of time. The Kanish Archaeological project began excavating that mound in 2013. The team is led by an international consortium. Researchers from the Centre for Studies in Archaeology, Arts and Heritage Sciences at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, working in partnership with the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, the University of Algarve in Portugal, and with the Slimani Antiquities and Heritage Directorate of the Kurdistan Regional Government. The project's directors, names like Maria da Conceição Lopes, André Tomé, and Steve Renette, have spent more than a decade returning to this mound, season after season, opening it carefully, layer by layer, with trowels and brushes and screens and patience. The first seasons in 2013, 2015 and 2016 established the basic stratigraphy of the site, the order of its layers, the dates of its occupations, the rough outline of what kind of place this had been at different points in its long life. A step trench was cut into the southern slope of the main mound to read the layers like a wall calendar. A larger excavation, 15 metres by 15 metres, was opened in the upper northeastern corner. Radiocarbon dating returned numbers from the entire late Chalcolithic period, across the centuries between roughly 4600 and 3100 years before Christ. The mound, the team confirmed, was old, genuinely, deeply, foundationally old. But what came next is what made Kanish matter, beyond the small valley where it sits. By the early 2020s, after years of careful work, the team announced something striking. Kanish, they said, was now to be considered the most important archaeological site east of the Tigris River, for understanding how human society developed during the 4th and 3rd millennia before Christ. That is not a small claim. The territory east of the Tigris includes vast stretches of Iraqi Kurdistan, western Iran, and the foothills of the Zagros, a region historically understudied, historically inaccessible to Western archaeology because of decades of war, sanctions, and political instability. There were great sites in this region: Godin Tepe in Iran, the magnificent late Chalcolithic mound at Tepegara near Mosul, the 3rd millennium urban centre at Tel Brak further west. But for the specific question of how the world's first city, Uruk, extended its reach into the eastern highlands, Kanish was emerging as one of the most informative sites available to archaeology. Then came the season of 2024. The team excavated a circular building toward the upper part of the tell dating to the early Bronze Age. Inside it they found a remarkable assemblage: 62 clay ceilings, 28 in one room and 34 in another. The small lumps of clay that ancient administrators pressed onto containers and rolled with cylinder seals as a kind of certification, along with the remains of barley, emmer wheat, lentils, chickpeas, peas. This was a grain storage facility. Based on the evidence assembled, it appears to have been an administrative facility, a building where food and goods were tracked, recorded, certified, controlled. The presence of so many ceilings was particularly striking. Ceilings imply documents. Documents imply record-keeping. Record-keeping implies authority. In a small mountain settlement 480 kilometres from the great administrative centre at Uruk, somebody, or rather, some institution, had been managing the flow of agricultural produce with techniques closely related to those used in the world's first city. That single building changed how the team thought about Kanish. The interpretation that this was a marginal place, a remote village, a passive recipient of cultural influences from far away. That interpretation did not survive contact with 62 ceilings. But what happened in the next field season, the season of 2025, was, in its quiet, professional, careful way, a kind of revolution. The 2025 excavation campaign at Kanish focused on the upper portion of the tell. The team had already established that the layer they were working on dated to the late Uruk period. That is, to the centuries between roughly 3,300 and 3,100 before Christ. This was the precise window during which the city of Uruk reached its greatest density of population, a peak of its wealth, and the height of its political and economic reach across the ancient world. Anything found in this layer, at this depth, would be contemporary with the construction of the great temples at Uruk itself. Whoever lived in this part of Kanish during this layer was alive at the same moment that the world's first urban civilization was being assembled. What the team uncovered, slowly and methodically over the course of the season, was the partial outline of a building that did not match anything else they had seen at the site. The walls were thicker than the walls of typical late Chalcolithic domestic structures. They were laid out with formal precision, rather than the more organic geometry of houses. The floor plan, as it emerged, suggested a tripartite arrangement. That is, a central long hall flanked by smaller rooms or chambers on its long sides. This particular plan is not just any plan. It is a plan that had become, over the course of the late 4th millennium, the architectural template of monumental religious construction in southern Mesopotamia. The earliest temples at Uruk were laid out this way. The stone cone temple at the Inana precinct was laid out this way. The limestone temple was laid out this way. The plan would persist with modifications across more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian sacred architecture, and it would influence, directly or indirectly, the design of every ziggurat that would later rise in the cities of Sumer and Akkad. To find that floor plan in the foothills of the Zagros, 480 kilometres from where it was developed, was already remarkable. But there was more. When the team brushed back the plaster of the walls, they began to see small, regular features pressed into the surface. Many of them in patterned rows. Each one was a small ceramic cone, fired hard, with a circular base showing flush with the wall surface. The bases had been painted, the classic Uruk colours, a palette dominated by black, red, and white. The arrangement was geometric, triangles meeting at their apices, diamonds repeating in horizontal bands, lines of zigzag motion across the wall like waves frozen in plaster. Anyone who has stood inside the German excavation displays of Uruk's monumental structures, or seen the reconstructed cone-mosaic at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, would have recognised the technique. This was the same Uruk wall cone tradition. The technique had been transferred, material, method, motif, across hundreds of kilometres of ancient landscape, and applied to a wall in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan in a manner directly comparable to what we see in southern Mesopotamia. Then, as the team continued working through the deposits associated with the building, two final objects were lifted out of the soil. The first was a small fragment of worked gold, described in the project's initial communications simply as a piece of a pendant. We do not know its full original form. We do not know what figure or motif it bore, what design had been pressed or hammered or engraved into its surface. We have a fragment. But we have a fragment of gold, and gold in this context is not background noise. Gold in this context means something specific. The southern Mesopotamian alluvial plain, where Uruk stood, produces no gold whatsoever. The plain is a flat sheet of fine river silt, perfect for growing barley and dates and emmer wheat in irrigated fields, but barren of stone, barren of timber, and barren of every metal humans had yet learned to work. Any gold present in the Uruk period world had to come from outside the alluvium, from the mountains of Iran, from the highlands of Anatolia, from regions reachable through long-distance exchange networks that crossed political boundaries and linguistic barriers, and bands of nomadic peoples in between. To find a gold pendant in any Uruk period building is unusual. To find one in a temple-like structure 480 kilometres from the imagined centre of the Uruk world, in the foothills of the very mountains that produce such metals, is something else entirely. It is a piece of evidence about the structure of the system itself. The second object was the cylinder seal. A cylinder seal in this period is one of the small but enormously consequential objects that defined the early Bronze Age. It is a short cylindrical piece of stone, typically about 2 to 3 centimetres in diameter, engraved with figures and motifs around its outer surface. Its function was simple and revolutionary at the same time. When it was rolled across a soft surface, a clay tablet, or a lump of wet clay sealing the lid of a jar or the door of a storeroom, it left behind a continuous repeating image. That image identified the seal's owner. It authenticated the document or the shipment or the transaction. It was, simultaneously, a signature, a watermark, a notarization, and a personal logo. In the absence of paper, in the absence of ink, in the absence of any of the technologies of bureaucratic identification we now take for granted, the cylinder seal was the device by which an organised administration could function at distance. It was the technology that made Uruk's economic reach possible. To find a late Uruk period cylinder seal in this mountain building is to find evidence that someone here, someone who used this building, or visited it, or supervised it, possessed administrative authority within a network that extended back to the great city in the south. The seal does not just say decoration. Based on what we know of how cylinder seals functioned, it points to office. It points to responsibility. It implies that this person at this place was authorized to mark documents that would be recognized hundreds of kilometers away. A monumental building, a wall encrusted with the architectural fingerprint of the world's first city, a fragment of gold, an administrative seal. The team that had been digging here for 12 seasons recognized exactly what they were looking at. They then did what professional archaeologists always do when they think they may have found something extraordinary. They went carefully. They issued a measured statement. They emphasized that further investigation was required to fully confirm the monumental nature of the building. They acknowledged the limits of what could be claimed from a single season of work. And then, almost in passing, they stated the implication. If this discovery held up, it would change the way the relationship between Uruk and its surrounding regions had been understood for a century. It is at this point, having walked the mound, having entered the building, having seen what was inside, that the next question becomes unavoidable. We have to understand what Uruk was, because nothing about the Kanish discovery makes sense unless we understand the place whose architectural language the building speaks. We are going to leave the mountain for a moment and travel south, across the Tigris, across the desert, down to the lower Mesopotamian plain. We are going to stand in a city that no longer exists, in a moment that has not been alive on the earth for 5,000 years, and we're going to look around. It is sometime around 3,300 years before Christ. We can imagine standing in the southern Mesopotamian plain, what is now the Muthana Governorate of Iraq, on a piece of slightly raised ground above the bed of an old channel of the Euphrates River. To the south and east, the marshes spread out toward the Persian Gulf, fed by the Tigris and the Euphrates, and threaded with reed islands and flocks of waterfowl. To the north and west, the land flattens into agricultural plain, intensively irrigated, producing more grain than almost any other landscape on Earth at that moment in human history. In front of us is something that has never existed before on this scale. It is a city. By the end of the Uruk period, around 3100 BCE, the settlement covered roughly 250 hectares, about 2.5 square kilometres, and within those boundaries lived tens of thousands of people. Population estimates for Uruk at its height vary considerably. Serious scholars have proposed figures ranging from 40,000 to as high as 80,000 inhabitants, with the wider area possibly supporting more. The exact number is debated, but every credible estimate places Uruk, in this moment, as among the largest concentrated human populations on Earth. Nothing else comes close. The Egyptian pre-dynastic centres along the Nile are smaller. The proto-urban settlements of the Indus Valley are smaller. The villages of the Iranian plateau and the upper Euphrates are far smaller. There is no city in the world like this. There has never been a city in the world like this, because the city, as a category of human settlement at this scale, is being invented here in real time. The site would later expand, in subsequent centuries, to as much as 600 hectares, 6 square kilometres. But at the moment when our story begins, it is still in its formative growth. The skyline is not flat. Two great religious complexes rise above the surrounding houses on platforms built up from the plain. To the northwest, a high terrace lifts a rectangular building of brilliant white gypsum plaster into the sun. The walls of this building stand high above the platform. The plaster is so white that, in the heat of the southern day, the structure shimmers. It would have been visible for many kilometres across the surrounding farmland, a kind of beacon. This is the White Temple, the sanctuary associated with the sky god An, sitting atop the Anu ziggurat, one of the earliest examples of the stepped temple platform that would later evolve into the great ziggurats of Sumer, the architectural ancestors of every legend that would later be told about towers built to reach the heavens. To the south of the Anu precinct, an even larger sacred district extends across the city. This is the Inana, a Sumerian word meaning house of heaven. It is dedicated to the goddess Inana, one of the most powerful and most multifaceted deities of the Uruk period pantheon. Inanna is the goddess of love, of war, of fertility, and of the morning star. She governs both desire and violence, the harvest and the slaughter, the union of bodies and the destruction of armies. In the religious imagination of Uruk, the city is hers in a profound institutional sense. The grain stored in the temple's storerooms is theologically her food. The wool clipped from the temple's flocks is theologically her clothing. The labour of the people who serve in the precinct is, in the cosmic accounting of the system, work performed for her. The Inanna at this moment is a complex of platforms, courtyards, halls, and sanctuaries that has been rebuilt many times. There is a limestone temple, raised on a rammed earth platform 2 metres above the plain. There is a stone cone temple, an early structure decorated with the cone-mosaic technique, surrounded by a buttressed limestone wall. There is a pillar temple, Temple C, in the modern archaeological labelling, whose columns are themselves covered in the cone mosaic. There is a great court. There is a hall of pillars whose facades shimmer with thousands of inset cone heads in red and white and black. The whole precinct is a kind of architectural symphony of the sacred, the largest concentration of monumental sacred construction that has yet been attempted by any human community. And in this city, in this precinct, in these decades, something else is being invented. It is something that nobody has any name for yet, because nothing like it has ever been seen. We will call it in retrospect writing. The first writing, the proto-cuneiform tablets recovered from the Inana precinct, around 5,000 of them in total across the relevant phases, is not what most people imagine when they hear that word. There is no poetry on them. There are no prayers, no laws, no lamentations, no declarations of love. The earliest writing is, almost without exception, accounting. It is lists of things, numbers of sheep, quantities of barley, beer rations distributed to workers, allotments of grain to labourers, counts of livestock entering the temple storehouse, and counts of livestock leaving it. The marks on the clay are pressed there because somebody, almost certainly somebody connected to the temple, needs to track who's been given what, and who owes what to whom, and how much remains in the storeroom. This is a strange and humbling fact to sit with. Writing. The technology that would eventually allow human beings to record the Iliad, the Quran, the Mahabharata, the speeches of the prophets, the love poems of Sappho, the philosophy of Aristotle, the diaries of teenagers in any city on earth, was invented to track institutional flows of grain, beer, livestock, and labour. But it was invented to do that in a particular kind of place. It was invented in a place that had so much to count, so many goats and so many sacks of barley, and so many vats of beer flowing into and out of so many storerooms run by so many different officials, that the human memory could no longer keep up with the volume of the transactions. The need to track the movement of resources through a temple-centred economy with tens of thousands of participants was, in the end, what forced the first marks to be pressed onto clay. Once those marks existed, however, they did not stay confined to accounting. Within a few generations they had begun to record names. Within a few centuries they had begun to record sentences. Within 1,000 years they would carry the great works of Mesopotamian literature. But the first marks were lists, and the first lists were written here, in the Inana, in the temple of Inana, in the city we are visiting in our imagination. And now, having stood for a moment in the city, we have to ask the question that has driven a century of debate among archaeologists, and that hangs over the entire mystery of the mountain temple at Kanish. How did Uruk feed itself? Before we follow the question of food and resources outward into the highlands, there is one more aspect of the city that bears closer attention, because it bears directly on what may have been happening inside the building at Kanish. We need to understand who Inanna was and what kind of religious institution her worship made possible. In the religious imagination of a late 4th millennium Uruk, Inanna is not a simple deity. She is, perhaps more than any other figure in the ancient Mesopotamian pantheon, a goddess of contradictions held in productive tension. She is the goddess of love, in the sense of romantic and sexual desire, the patroness of the act by which human beings join together and produce children, the divine guarantor of the fertility of bodies and of the fertility of the land. She is simultaneously the goddess of war, the patroness of armies, of the violence by which one community conquers another, of the spear and the shield and the chariot. She is the morning star, Venus, that bright planet whose appearance just before dawn announces the arrival of light. She is also the evening star, the same planet at the other end of the day, the herald of the descent into night. She is the queen of heaven, and she is the goddess who, in one of her most famous mythological cycles, descends into the underworld and is, for a time, the queen of death. These are not random combinations. They are deeply structured. Inanna is the goddess of all the moments at which the boundary between things becomes unstable. Desire and violence, day and night, life and death, fertility and destruction. She is the divine principle of transformation, of crossing thresholds, of forces that escape the categories that would contain them. Her worship at Uruk, as it can be reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence of the late 4th millennium and the much fuller evidence of later Mesopotamian texts, was not simply a matter of prayers and offerings. The Inana precinct dedicated to her was an economic engine of the city. Thousands of clay tablets, the proto-cuneiform records of the temple administration, have been recovered from its layers, records of incoming grain, outgoing rations, livestock counts, weaving production, beer brewing, oil pressing. The temple was not a building set apart from daily life. It was the central institution through which much of the daily life of the city was organised. To make an offering to Inanna was, in administrative terms, to deposit a quantity of barley in her storehouse. To work in her name was to weave wool that became theologically her clothing, and that was distributed by the temple to the wider community as part of its redistributive economy. This is a fundamentally different model of religion from the one most modern audiences inherit from later monotheistic traditions. The Inana of Uruk was not approached primarily through individual contemplative prayer. She was approached through institutional participation. To be a member of her city was to be, in some sense, a worker in her household, entitled to her redistribution, obligated to her offerings, present at her festivals, married into her economic and religious order. This matters for Kanish because when we ask what was being practiced in the building with the cone-mosaic walls, we are not necessarily asking about private devotion. We may be asking about institutional affiliation. To build a temple in the architectural style of the Inana, 480 kilometres from the Inana itself, could plausibly be read as a declaration that this place too was, in some structural sense, part of the same religious tradition, that the goods stored within it might be understood as the deity's goods, that the records authenticated by the cylinder seal were her records, that the gold deposited within it could have been her gold. We cannot prove this in any strict sense. The deity worshipped at Kanish may have been Inanna, or An, or some combination of the two, or a local Highland deity addressed in southern architectural language, or a syncretic figure that does not map cleanly onto any single name we currently recognise. But the architectural language strongly suggests that whatever was being done inside that building was understood by its participants as part of a religious tradition with deep ties to the south. The mountain temple, based on its style alone, was speaking the same theological language that was being spoken in the great precinct of the Queen of Heaven, and it was speaking that language with full architectural fluency. The southern Mesopotamian plain is a strange place to put a civilization. It is, in some ways, among the most agriculturally productive landscapes on Earth. A wide, flat alluvial floodplain laid down by two great rivers over millions of years, with soil so fine and so deep that, given water, almost anything will grow in it. Barley grows here in such abundance that the Sumerian language has multiple words for different stages of its harvest. Date palms thrive along the irrigation canals, sheep and goats fatten on the stubble of the fields, the marshlands offer fish, waterfowl, reed for construction, and a unique ecological niche that supports its own way of life. But the plain produces almost nothing else. There is no stone in the alluvium, the soil is too fine, the bedrock lies far below. The earliest inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia had to import the limestone for the foundation of the Iana's stone temple from an outcrop 60 kilometres east of Uruk, and that was just for the foundation. There is no timber. The plain has the date palm and the willow, and a few hardy shrubs, and that is essentially all. The cedars and pines and hardwoods that the temples and palaces and ships of Uruk required had to come from far away, from the Lebanon mountains, from the Taurus range in southern Turkey, from the highlands of Iran, from anywhere that mountains catch enough rainfall to grow real trees. There is no copper. The plain is an iron-poor floodplain. Metallurgy here is impossible without imported ore. There is no tin. There is no lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone the Sumerians prized above almost all others, which can be found in the entire ancient world only in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan. There is no carnelian. There is no chlorite. There is, of course, no gold. Everything that was not grain or fish or reed had to come from outside the alluvium, and so the inhabitants of Uruk did what people in their position have done in every age. They built, very deliberately, the apparatus for getting it. The phenomenon that scholars now call the Uruk expansion, sometimes also called the Uruk phenomenon, is, by most reckonings, the world's earliest archaeologically documented system of long-distance economic and cultural reach. It begins in the early 4th millennium and intensifies through the middle and late 4th millennium. By around 3500 before Christ, Uruk-style material culture is appearing at sites along the Euphrates as far north as what is now southeastern Turkey, along the Tigris up to Nineveh and beyond, eastward into the foothills of the Zagros and the plains of southwestern Iran, westward into Syria. The objects found at these sites form a recognisable cultural toolkit. There are the ubiquitous beveled rim bowls, small, crude, mass-produced ceramic bowls so common at Uruk period sites that, on some excavations, they make up the majority of all the pottery recovered. There are the wheel-made, fine wares characteristic of southern Mesopotamian ceramic traditions. There are cylinder seals, There are clay ceilings. There are numerical tablets and the earliest forms of proto-cuneiform. There is the architecture itself, the tripartite floor plan, the niched and buttressed walls, the cone mosaics, the Rimchen-style mud bricks of the late Uruk tradition. This entire cultural package travels sometimes in fragments, sometimes in remarkably complete form, hundreds of kilometres from the place where it originated. Modern archaeology has learned to distinguish, very roughly, between different types of Uruk sites in this expanded zone. Some appear to be true colonies, entirely new settlements, founded on previously unoccupied ground, populated by people who arrived from southern Mesopotamia, carrying their own architectural traditions, their own administrative practices, their own religious imagination. Habuba Kabira, a site on the Great Bend of the Euphrates in what is now Syria, is the most famous example. It was a planned town with regular streets and southern-style architecture, dropped into a foreign landscape and abandoned within a few generations. Other sites are what archaeologists call enclaves, small districts of southern-style material culture embedded within otherwise local settlements, suggesting that small communities of southerners were living within larger native populations. Hasinebi Tepe, in Turkey, is a clear example. A third category, the most interesting and the most difficult to interpret, are sites where local communities adopt elements of Uruk material culture, perhaps because of trade contact, perhaps because of cultural prestige, perhaps because of more complex relationships of imitation and identity. The crucial question, in every case, is this: what was Uruk getting out of it? The answer that the archaeology supports is not a simple military answer. The Uruk expansion does not appear to have been a campaign of conquest. There is no clear archaeological evidence of warfare between southern colonists and local populations during this period at most sites. There is no evidence of large-scale mass production at the colonies aimed solely at extracting resources for shipment south. What there is instead is evidence consistent with trade. Bitumen, the natural tar used as adhesive, mortar and waterproofing in southern Mesopotamia, is shown by isotopic analysis to have moved across the network. Stone moves. Metals move. The patterns suggest a system of exchange rather than pure extraction. But trade requires safety. Trade requires routes. Trade requires nodes, places along the way where caravans can rest, where storerooms can be filled and emptied, where local populations can be persuaded to provide guides and pack animals and food. And the maps that archaeologists have been building generation by generation of where Uruk-influenced sites appear look unmistakably like maps of routes. There are sites along the Euphrates leading north and west. There are sites along the Tigris leading north. There are sites along the foothills of the Zagros leading east. There is a particular concentration along what would later become a precursor to the Khorasan Road, the great east-west route connecting the Mesopotamian plain to the Iranian plateau. Godin Tepe, in the central Zagros of western Iran, is perhaps the most famous of these eastern routing sites. There, on top of an existing local settlement, a small enclosed compound was built with material culture characteristic of southern Mesopotamia. The compound included some of the earliest known evidence of wine production in the broader Mesopotamian sphere, though it is important to note that even older evidence for wine has been recovered elsewhere, including at Haji Firuz Tepe in northwestern Iran. Godin Tepe is generally interpreted as a southern trading post, or possibly a local administrative centre under southern influence, a place where merchants and administrators connected to the Uruk world could establish a foothold in the highlands, exchange their textiles and grain for the metals and stones they needed, and return south. Now look at a map of the late 4th millennium ancient Near East. Locate Uruk in the south, trace a line northward through the alluvial plain, then northeast across the Tigris, then up into the foothills of the Zagros. About 480 kilometres from Uruk, near the modern town of Suleymaniye, the line crosses a small valley in the Bazian basin. There, on a piece of slightly raised ground, sits a tell. Inside the tell, a building has been uncovered with thick walls and a tripartite floor plan. The walls are covered with cone mosaics. There is a fragment of a gold pendant in the debris. There is a cylinder seal. Kanish is not at the edge of nowhere. Kanish is on a corridor. It sits at one of the points where the alluvial plain meets the highlands, exactly the kind of strategic gateway that would naturally control the movement of people and goods between the food-producing flatlands and the resource-producing mountains. It is the kind of place that, if Uruk wanted to access the metals, the stones, the timber, and especially the gold of the Highlands, it would need to be in contact with. The wall cones, the tripartite plan, the cylinder seal, the gold, these objects are not random. The most parsimonious reading is that they are the objects of a trading and cultural system that depended for its survival on places like Kanish. The mountain temple is not, on this reading, an accident. It is a node in a network, but to understand what kind of node it was, we have to look more closely at the most distinctive object of all. We have to look in detail at the wall cones. The wall cone mosaic is one of those archaeological techniques that, once you understand how it was made, leaves you slightly stunned at what was involved. It begins with the cones themselves. Each one is a small, slightly tapered piece of fired clay, typically several centimetres in length, narrowing to a point at one end and broadening at the other into a circular disc roughly 2 to 3 centimetres across. The disc end is the visible end. The pointed end is the embedded end. To make a single cone takes a small piece of clay, a quick shaping by hand or with a simple tool, a firing in a kiln, and, if the design calls for it, the application of paint to the visible disc. White paint, black paint, red paint. In some specific contexts at Uruk, the cones are made of coloured stone instead of clay, which means quarrying and shaping each one individually. Either way, each cone is a small object that takes time, material, and labour to produce. Now consider that the buildings at Uruk that used this technique were covered in cones by the thousand. Tens of thousands. In the case of the largest cone mosaic facades, hundreds of thousands. Each cone had to be inserted point first into a layer of wet plaster applied to the wall before the plaster could dry. The cones had to be set close enough together that the painted disc ends formed a continuous decorated surface, with no gaps between them. The pattern had to be planned in advance because once a cone was set into its position, repositioning it without damaging the plaster would be difficult. The cones themselves had to be sorted by colour before installation, so that the pattern could be assembled rapidly while the plaster was still pliable. Imagine for a moment the labour scene. A wall has been freshly plastered. A team of workers stands ready with sorted bins of cones. Black, white, red. The pattern is being directed by some kind of master craftsman who knows the design and walks the line, calling out colours. The workers press cone after cone into the wet surface, working swiftly, working in coordinated rhythm, while the plaster is workable. The pattern emerges in horizontal bands across the wall, perhaps a row of triangles meeting at their apices, perhaps a band of zigzags running corner to corner, perhaps a field of diamonds repeating across an entire facade. By the time the plaster dries, the pattern is locked into the wall, as if the wall itself had grown that pattern out of its own substance. When the sun strikes a cone mosaic surface, particularly the surfaces of sanctuary buildings, which were often raised on elevated platforms catching the morning light, the painted discs reflect light unevenly, in a way that smooth painted plaster cannot. The wall has a kind of texture, a controlled roughness that creates a shimmer at certain angles. The geometry seems to move. Inside an enclosed courtyard surrounded by these walls, the visual effect, based on what we can reconstruct, would have been deliberately disorienting. A designed sensory environment, calibrated to convey a sense that you were not in an ordinary place. You were in the house of a god. The cone mosaic technique appears in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia in the middle of the 4th millennium before Christ. By the late 4th millennium, it has become the defining decorative system of the Inana and Anu precincts at Uruk. It is closely associated throughout its history with monumental religious construction. In southern Mesopotamia itself, the technique is found at Uruk and at a few other sites of major religious importance, and in domestic settings it is essentially absent. It is not used on private houses or workshops or storerooms. It is reserved for the sacred and the public. Outside of southern Mesopotamia, the cone mosaic technique is, until recently, extraordinarily rare. There are scattered examples at sites within the Uruk cultural zone, but most of them appear at known major centres of southern interaction, places that we know, on independent grounds, were heavily integrated into the Uruk world. The reason for this rarity is straightforward. The cone mosaic was not just a piece of architectural decoration. It functioned, we can reasonably infer, as a piece of architectural language. It said something specific. It said, this is a building of the Uruk type. This is a building of the Mesopotamian sacred tradition. This is a place where the gods of Uruk are at home. A community that built a wall with cone mosaics on it was, on this reading, not just borrowing a pretty style. It was making a religious and cultural statement in the architectural vocabulary of a particular system. Now look again at the building at Kanish, 480 kilometres from Uruk, in the foothills of the Zagros, with wall cones pressed into the plaster of its walls, the technical knowledge required to build that wall, how to make the cones, how to fire them, how to mix the plaster, how to set the cones in time, how to plan and lay out the geometric pattern, is not knowledge that travels casually. It does not move through trade goods alone, it does not move through hearsay, it moves through people. Either someone from the south came to this mountain valley and supervised the construction, or someone from the mountain valley spent enough time in the south working alongside southern craftsmen to learn the technique and bring it home, or some combination of both, with master craftsmen and local apprentices working together. In every case, the wall cone mosaic at Kanish is, by the most reasonable reading, a record of human movement, of the literal travel of skilled hands across hundreds of kilometres, carrying the knowledge of how to build a sacred wall, and it is a record of intention. Whoever commissioned this building did not simply want a large structure. They wanted a building that resembled the temples of Uruk. They wanted in the mountains the architectural form of the city in the south. The building was meant to be recognised by anyone who saw it as belonging to a particular tradition. It was, we can infer, a statement of affiliation written in clay and plaster. The team's interpretation of Kanish as integrated into a cultural and political network connected to Uruk is not a hopeful overstatement. It is what a wall encrusted with carefully placed cones, in this technique, in this place, very nearly demands. The mountain temple was not influenced by Uruk in some vague sense. It appears to have been an active node within Uruk's religious and political language, speaking that language through its very walls. It is worth, before going further, taking a single deep breath and looking around at the rest of the planet at the moment when this mountain temple was being built. Because one of the strangest and most underappreciated aspects of the Uruk phenomenon is how unique it was on the global stage of its own time. In 3300 before Christ, the Egyptian Nile Valley is in the middle of its pre-dynastic period, a time of remarkable cultural creativity and increasing political consolidation, but not yet the unified state that would emerge under the first dynasty around 3100 before Christ. The great early Egyptian centres, Hierakonpolis, Nakada, Abydos, are growing rapidly, producing the elaborate ceramic traditions and the foundational political structures that will lead, within a few generations, to the emergence of the pharaonic state. But pharaonic Egypt does not yet exist. The pyramids are nearly 1,000 years in the future. Hieroglyphic writing is in its earliest formative stages, possibly emerging in dialogue with the writing system being developed at Uruk, possibly developing independently, possibly some combination of both. The question is still debated by Egyptologists. The Nile is producing sophistication, but it has not yet produced anything quite like the city that exists at Uruk. In the Indus Valley, what we now call Pakistan and northwestern India, the early Harappan period is underway. There are settlements at sites like Mehrgarh and Repmanderi and Kotdiji that show the beginnings of urban planning, the development of distinct ceramic traditions, and the emergence of social complexity. But the great Indus cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, are still 600 or 700 years away from their full urban expression. The Indus script will not appear until much later. The Indus people are on a path toward urbanism, but they have not yet arrived where Uruk has arrived. In China, in the lower Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys, late Neolithic cultures like the Liangzhu and the Longshan are building remarkable jade traditions, beginning to construct earthen platforms that hint at later monumental building, organising themselves into proto-state polities. But the dynasties of Chinese tradition, Jia, Shang, Zhou, are still 1,000 years and more in the future. Chinese writing has not yet been invented in any form recognisable to later script traditions. In the Americas, in Europe, across the great steppes of Central Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, hunter-gatherer and early agricultural communities are living their lives in the patterns that have characterised human existence for tens of thousands of years. There are no cities of comparable scale. There are no states of comparable complexity. There is no writing. There are no temples constructed at the scale of those rising at Uruk. What this means is that, at the precise moment when the building at Kanish was being constructed in the foothills of the Zagros, only one place on Earth had reached the kind of political and cultural complexity that the Uruk world represented, and that one place was reaching outward into the surrounding regions, in the form of the Uruk expansion. The mountain temple at Kanish was not just a temple. It was, the evidence suggests, one of the earliest examples in human history of cultural projection across long distance, an early instance of the kind of phenomenon that would later become so common in the form of empires and trading systems and religious networks that we would forget how astonishing it was the first time it happened. There were no other Uruks. There was nothing else on Earth in 3300 before Christ that was doing what Uruk was doing at this scale. The cone-mosaic technique, the cylinder seal system, the proto-cuneiform tablets, the monumental temple architecture, none of these had any close parallel anywhere else in the world at the time. The people who built the mountain temple at Kanish were participating in something that was, at the moment of its happening, nearly unprecedented on the surface of the Earth. And then, within a few centuries, the experiment would partially collapse, regroup, and seed multiple successor traditions. Traditions that would, over the following millennia, fill out the rest of the picture. Egypt would produce its own pharaonic civilization. The Indus cities would rise. The Chinese dynasties would begin. Civilizations would emerge in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, in the Mediterranean. But all of those happened later. Kanish's mountain temple is part of the very first wave. It is part of the original phenomenon. This is what makes it precious in a way that goes beyond the materials of which it is made. It is one of the earliest physical pieces of evidence, anywhere on Earth, of a community that was not just locally complex, but participating in a network that crossed great distances. It is a piece of the prototype for what would later be called civilization. The cylinder seal is a small object. Most of them, across the entire span of their use in the ancient Near East, are between 2 and 3 centimeters in diameter and between 1 and 3 centimeters in height. They are typically pierced through their long axis so that a cord can be passed through and the seal can be worn around the neck, tied to a wrist or attached to a garment. They are made of a wide range of materials: limestone, marble, lapis lazuli, serpentine, hematite, chalcedony, and many others. The choice of material is significant. Harder, rarer stones were typically the preserve of higher-ranking individuals, but the function is the same regardless of material. The seal is engraved on its outer surface with a continuous design, intended to be rolled out across a soft medium so that the design appears as an unbroken band of imagery. This is a technology of identity in a world that does not yet have a written script capable of recording personal names in any general way. By the time the early cuneiform tablets begin to appear at Uruk, in the late 4th millennium, the cylinder seal has already been in use for some centuries. In an economy where goods are constantly moving, into temples, out of storerooms, between cities, along rivers, across borders, somebody has to be responsible for them. Somebody has to authenticate the shipment, the contract, the storage. The cylinder seal is how this is done. A jar of oil, a basket of grain, a sealed door of a storeroom. All of these can be secured by pressing a lump of clay over the joining point or the closing mechanism, and then rolling a cylinder seal across the soft clay surface. The resulting impression is a kind of identifier, a notification that says, in effect, this was sealed by such and such an authority, and any tampering with this seal will be evident the next time it is examined. Once dried, the clay sealing is durable and difficult to forge. To get into the contents legitimately, you have to break the clay sealing. To open it illegitimately, you have to fake the seal impression, and the carving on a cylinder seal is, in its details, almost impossible to reproduce by hand. In the late Uruk period, cylinder seals develop into a distinct artistic and administrative tradition. The motifs carved into them are remarkably varied. Scenes of priests making offerings, herds of animals on the move, mythical creatures intertwined in heraldic compositions, the image of a priest-king figure leading processions or hunting lions, ritual scenes around a temple facade. The designs are not random decoration. They appear to function as visual languages, coded with information about the seal owner's office, role, or institutional affiliation. A seal showing offering scenes around a particular temple is likely owned by an official connected to that temple. A seal showing accounting motifs is likely owned by an administrator. The picture, in this period, does the work that a written name would later do. The cylinder seal, in other words, is best understood as a piece of personal authority made portable. It is the stamp of the office hung around the neck of the office holder. Now consider the cylinder seal that emerged from the upper layers of the building at Kanish. We do not yet have detailed publication of the seal's iconography. That information will appear in the team's full preliminary report, expected in the months following the announcement. But we know it is from the Uruk period. We know it was found in association with a building decorated in the Uruk monumental tradition. We know it was found alongside a fragment of gold in a layer dating to the very window, between 3300 and 3100 before Christ, when the Uruk expansion was at its peak. What this tells us about the people who used this building is significant. Whoever they were almost certainly not isolated villagers. They were not even simply local elites who happened to admire the high style of the South. They were people who had been issued, or who had commissioned, an instrument of administrative authority valid within a system that extended back to the world's first city. They could mark documents, they could authenticate transactions, they could close storerooms and claim ownership of their contents in a way that would, in principle, be respected hundreds of kilometres away. Combine this with the gold pendant and the picture sharpens. Gold, in the late 4th millennium, was not jewellery casually worn. It was not a personal indulgence. It was an extraordinarily rare material, available only through specific long-distance exchange networks, and its presence at any given site is, almost without exception, an indication of one of two things: a person of very high status, or a place of religious importance. In the Uruk world, gold and the divine are deeply connected. Later Mesopotamian temple inventories, when they begin to be recorded in writing, repeatedly list gold among the offerings made to the gods. Statues of deities are described as being clothed in gold. Cult objects are made of gold. Gold is the material of theological visibility, the substance whose unique property of never tarnishing makes it the metal of permanence and the metal of the divine. A gold pendant in a temple at Kanish, then, is most plausibly read as either a piece of an item worn by a high-status individual conducting some kind of ceremonial or administrative role at the site, or as an offering, something that was deliberately deposited, placed in a sacred context as a gift to whatever divine presence was understood to inhabit the building. Either possibility tells us something. Either possibility is consistent with the interpretation of the structure as a place of cultic and administrative significance. What we cannot know, at least not yet, is the name of the person who stood in this building and looked at these walls. We do not know whether this individual considered themselves a colonist, a representative, a delegate, a local elite who had adopted the southern style, or some hybrid identity not easily reducible to our modern categories. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they prayed for. We do not know whether they were born here, in the foothills, and went south as young adults to learn the practices of the temples, or whether they came north already fully formed in their southern training, sent here by some authority to establish or maintain a node of the network. Any of these reconstructions is possible. The evidence narrows the picture, but does not focus it sharply. What the evidence does insist on is that this was a person who mattered. This was a person of authority, with access to the rarest materials of their age, located at one of the most strategic points in the early Bronze Age trading system, and choosing to construct a building whose every architectural feature announced their integration into one of the most powerful cultural projects of the era. There is a particular silence at the heart of the Kanish discovery, and we have to walk into it carefully, because what we say about this silence will shape everything else we say about the building. The silence is this: we do not yet know who was worshipped here. There is no altar that has been clearly identified in the published material. There is no figurine, no statuette, no sculpted image of a deity reported. There is no inscription naming a god. And for this layer of time, there could not be such a fully developed inscription, because the writing system that would later record divine names was, in 3300 before Christ, still being assembled. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets do contain divine names, references to An, references to Inana, references to figures like Enlil and Nana and Utu. But those references appear in administrative contexts, in lists of provisions for temples or quantities of goods received from temples. They do not yet form the body of religious literature that, 1,000 years later, would tell us in detail what each god looked like, where each god lived, what each god demanded. What we have at Kanish is a building. We have the architectural form of the building, we have the decorative system on its walls, we have the objects deposited within and around it. From this combination of evidence, the team has identified the structure as a likely cultic space. That is, a place used for some kind of ritual or religious activity, but they have done so very cautiously, emphasizing that further investigation is needed, so we are left to infer, and the inference, when we follow the architecture, leads us back to Uruk. In the religious life of late 4th millennium Uruk, two deities dominate above all others. The first is An, the sky god, the supreme male principle of the early Mesopotamian pantheon, whose name simply means heaven. His sanctuary is the Anu precinct, and it is from the elevated platform of his ziggurat that the white temple gleams above the city. The second is Inana, younger, more dynamic, more ferocious, more multivalent than An. Inanna is goddess of love and goddess of war, the morning and evening star, the patroness of the city of Uruk in particular, and of human desire in general. Her sanctuary is the Inanna precinct, and it grows, over the course of the late Uruk period, into one of the largest and most architecturally complex religious complexes on Earth at that time. The wall cone mosaic technique, the very technique we have been tracing, is, in southern Mesopotamia, primarily associated with the buildings of these two precincts. To build a wall cone mosaic was, on the most natural reading of the evidence, to invoke architecturally the sacred space of An or Inanna. If the building at Kanish was a temple, and if its architectural language was the architectural language of Uruk's sacred tradition, then we can reasonably infer at least a strong likelihood that the deity worshipped within it was understood to be a member of the same divine family, perhaps Inanna, perhaps An, perhaps a local mountain deity whose worship was expressed in the architectural vocabulary of the south, and who was therefore considered, in some sense, equivalent to or affiliated with the deities of the south. The religious imagination of the Uruk period world was capacious. It allowed for multiple identifications, for the same divine being to be addressed under different names in different localities, for syncretic associations that we, with our later monotheistic instincts, sometimes find harder to grasp. What is most important, however, is the broader theological assumption underlying Mesopotamian religion in this period. To the people of the Uruk world, gods did not float abstractly above the landscape. They lived in their temples. The temple was, theologically, the dwelling place of the deity, the god's house, the god's body in stone and brick, the god's address. Offerings made at the temple were food for the god. Labour performed for the temple was service to the god. The economic complex around the temple, the storerooms, the workshops, the fields, was the god's economic complex. The boundary between religion and economy in this period is not the boundary we draw today. They were, for practical purposes, the same thing. This means that when a community built a temple, when they laid out the foundations, raised the walls, decorated them in the appropriate style, and set within them the appropriate offerings, they were not simply making a building, they were preparing a residence. They were inviting a divine presence to come and live. The architectural form was not arbitrary. It was the form a god could recognize as home. The cone mosaics were not optional decoration. They were the visual signature of sacred space, the material proof that this was a structure properly prepared to house a deity. To build a wall cone mosaic in a small valley in the Zagros, then, was to make a particular kind of theological claim. We can reasonably read it as a declaration that this place, 480 kilometres from the great precincts of the south, was now also a place fit for a god. It was to extend the religious geography of Uruk into the mountains. It was, on this reading, to say, the gods of the south are at home here also. And there is one more piece of context that bears on this question. The site's late Uruk period occupation, the very layer in which the temple-like building appears, ended in a fire. The destruction is visible in the soil, burnt material, scorched surfaces, the kind of consistent thermal damage that indicates the structure burned down, or was burned down at some point near the end of its useful life. We do not yet know whether the fire was accidental or deliberate. We do not yet know whether the fire was a single event or part of a broader collapse. What we do know is that, around 3100 before Christ, the entire phenomenon of the Uruk expansion came undone. Across the whole of the network, from the upper Euphrates to the southwestern Iranian plateau, many of the colonies and contact sites were abandoned within a few generations. Whatever forces had held the network together stopped working. Whatever flow of goods, ideas and people had sustained it diminished. By the early 3rd millennium, the Uruk world as it had existed in the late 4th millennium was a memory. New regional cultures rose up in its place. Proto-Elamite in southwestern Iran, Nineveh V and Ninevite cultures in the north, and the great expansion that had carried Uruk's fingerprint into the highlands was over. At Kanish, this transition is visible in the layers of the mound. The Uruk period level ends in conflagration. There is a phase of disuse, or of much reduced activity. Then, in the early dynastic period, a few centuries later, the site is reoccupied, but in a different cultural mode, no longer with the architectural language of the Uruk south. The mountain settlement continues its long history, but its character has changed. This timing raises a question that may not be answerable, but is impossible not to ask. The gold pendant and the cylinder seal in the temple at Kanish, were they left in place because the building was abandoned in haste, perhaps in flight from danger, perhaps in confusion or panic? Or were they placed there deliberately as final offerings when the community made the decision to close the sacred building for the last time? Were they the residue of crisis or the residue of ritual? The objects themselves cannot definitively tell us. The pattern of the deposition, when more fully published, may help us guess. But there is at least the possibility that what we have at Kanish is not the wreckage of a hasty abandonment, but the carefully placed last gifts of a community ending a long relationship with a mountain deity, sealing the building beneath a roof that would soon fall. Either possibility is heartbreaking, either possibility is also magnificent. They are both, on present evidence, consistent with what has been recovered, and they are both reminders that what we are looking at, when we look at the gold pendant in the dirt of the upper layer, is not just the residue of an institution. It is the residue of human moments, of decisions made by particular people on particular days, for reasons we may never fully recover. To understand fully what the mountain temple may have meant, in its own place and time, we have to understand how the people of the Mesopotamian plain understood the mountains themselves. The Zagros range, in the religious and literary imagination of the Sumerians and their successors, was an ambiguous and even paradoxical place. It was the boundary of the known world, the wall beyond which the cultivated plain ended and something other began. It was the direction of the rising sun. The sun god Utu, in later texts, is associated with the eastern mountains as the place from which he emerges each dawn. It was the source of the rivers that gave the alluvial plain its life, the Tigris and the smaller streams that fed into it from the highland watersheds. In this respect, the Zagros was sacred. It was the direction of light, of life-giving water, of cosmic order. But it was also, in the same imaginative tradition, the direction of barbarism, of mystery, of danger, of death. Later Mesopotamian texts speak of the highlands as a place where the souls of the dead were sometimes thought to gather. Mountain peoples are repeatedly described in the literature in disparaging or exoticizing terms. The Babylonian poem known as the Curse of Agard famously describes a mountain people, the Guti, in dehumanizing terms, a description that says far more about the Mesopotamian fear of the mountains than it does about the actual people of the highlands. The mountains were where the strange came from. The mountains were where empires occasionally lost their armies. The mountains were where the rules of the plain stopped applying, and yet the same mountains were the source of almost everything the cities of the plain depended on. The metals, copper, lead, silver, eventually tin, came through the mountains. The hard stones came from the mountains. The timber came from the mountains. The lapis lazuli, travelling from the far eastern Iranian highlands and beyond, passed through the mountains. The gold, when it appeared, came from the mountains. Uruk could not exist as Uruk without continuous, sustained contact with the world that began where the floodplain ended. The highland communities on their side looked out at the cities of the plain with their own complicated set of feelings. Some of those feelings have not survived in any literary source. We do not have the equivalent of the Curse of Agade written from the perspective of a Zagros tribe. But we can read some of those feelings indirectly through the archaeology. The ones who built Kanish were not separated from the south by ignorance or by hostility. They had access to southern cylinder seals. They had access to southern architectural traditions. They had access to gold that the south desperately needed and could only obtain through highland intermediaries. The evidence implies they were players, not pawns. They sat at one of the most strategic gateways between the two worlds, and their material culture suggests they were comfortable with that role. Comfortable enough to commission a building that combined the architectural language of the south with the resources of the highland network. This is one of the most important shifts that the Kanish discovery is helping to drive. For most of the 20th century, the dominant scholarly model of the Uruk expansion was a kind of centre and periphery model, Uruk and its sister cities of southern Mesopotamia were the centre, the place where civilization happened. Everywhere else, including the highlands, was the periphery, the place where civilization was passively received, copied or imitated, but never originated. In this model, sites like Kanish were footnotes. They were places on the way to other places. They were of interest mainly as examples of how Uruk's influence reached beyond its core. The centre and periphery model has been under increasing pressure for at least a generation, as more and more sites have been excavated in the highlands and the north, and as the picture of those sites has become richer. Tel Brak, in northeastern Syria, has emerged as an indigenous urban centre predating the Uruk expansion in its earliest urban phases, challenging the idea that the south invented urbanism alone. Tepe Gara in northern Iraq has revealed sophisticated administrative and religious architecture in periods earlier than the classic Uruk expansion. Sites in the Zagros foothills have shown that institutional life, temples, storage, central food administration, was developing locally, in conversation with but not solely derived from the south. Kanish now joins these sites as another piece of evidence that the highlands of the eastern Fertile Crescent were not a passive landscape across which civilization radiated. They appear instead to have been a participant landscape. The communities living in these mountain valleys were, on the available evidence, active in shaping the very networks that made Uruk's reach possible. They controlled the routes, they controlled the resources, they built their own monumental architecture, they held administrative authority. When they built a temple in the high style of the south, they were, on this reading, not simply imitating their betters, they were declaring their place in a network they were actively contributing to. This may sound like a small adjustment in interpretation. It is not. The narrative shift it represents, from a story of one centre and many peripheries to a story of multiple, interconnected, interacting centres in a vast network, is the difference between two fundamentally different pictures of how civilization began. In the older picture, civilization happens in one place and spreads outward like a stain. In the newer picture, civilization happens across a wide, multi-nodal landscape, with information and people and goods flowing in multiple directions, and the great cities of the south are not the only authors of the story. They are the most visible authors, they left the most monumental records, but they were not by themselves the whole story. The mountain temple at Kanish is part of the evidence that supports this newer picture, and it does so quietly, without fanfare, as a small building in a small valley in a region of the world that until very recently was almost completely unknown to international archaeology. The valley that contains Kanish is not, as it happens, an isolated valley. The Bazian Basin and the surrounding foothills hold a number of other archaeological sites of comparable date, and the picture that has been emerging from them over the past decade is one that gives the discovery at Kanish additional context. Roughly to the southwest of Kanish, on the same general drainage system, lie the closely associated sites of Girdikala and Legaden. These have been excavated over the past several seasons by a French-led international team, and they have revealed evidence of substantial late Chalcolithic and Uruk period occupation, including elements that, like Kanish, appear to demonstrate close connection to the southern Mesopotamian cultural sphere. Legaden in particular has produced architectural features and ceramic assemblages consistent with what is now sometimes called the Uruk presence in the western Zagros, alongside earlier indigenous traditions that predate the southern expansion. These sites, taken together with Kanish, suggest that the foothills of the central Zagros, the corridor between the alluvial plain and the mountain interior, were dotted with settlements that participated at varying intensities in the Uruk-era network. Further to the south, in the lower Sirwan and upper Diyala river valleys, lies the site of Shaki Kora, alongside other settlements like Malakunar. The work at Shaki Kora, conducted by an international team led by Professor Claudia Glatz at the University of Glasgow as part of the Sirwan Regional Project, has produced what may be one of the most important recent additions to our understanding of late 4th millennium institutional life in this region. There, archaeologists have uncovered a sequence of 4 late Chalcolithic institutional households, buildings that appear to have served centralized administrative functions, controlling the redistribution of food and other goods within their local communities. These households were locally indigenous in their earliest phases, predating the Uruk expansion, before becoming integrated into the wider Uruk period system. And then, intriguingly, the inhabitants of the region appear to have actively rejected centralized institutional life. After centuries of participation, the population dispersed. Smaller, more local settlement patterns reasserted themselves. The institutional households were not rebuilt. The kind of centralised organisation that Uruk had carried into the highlands was, in the Sirwan-Diyala area, deliberately set aside and would not return for many centuries. The contrast is striking, and it is illuminating. Kanish was integrated into the Uruk network. Shaki Kora, not far away, was integrated and then withdrew. Both responses are visible in the archaeology. Neither is the only possible response. The communities of the late 4th millennium Eastern Fertile Crescent were not a monolith. They made different choices in different valleys about how deeply to participate in the southern system and about whether and when to step away from it. What this means for understanding Kanish is that the building uncovered in 2025 cannot be read as the product of an inevitable cultural radiation. It was the product of choices made by particular people in this particular valley at this particular moment to invest the labour and resources required to build a monumental structure in the high architectural style of the south. Other valleys made other choices. Some adopted the style and then discarded it. Some adopted parts of it and not others. Some refused. The map of late 4th millennium Uruk influence is not a uniform stain spreading outward from the south. It is a patchwork of agreements and refusals, integrations and resistances, full participations and partial ones. In the middle of that patchwork, somewhere along the seam, where the alluvial world ended and the highland world began, the people of Kanish chose to build a temple. We do not know exactly why they made this choice. We do not know what the choice cost them or what it gained them. But the choice itself is now visible to us, in the form of cone-encrusted walls in the upper layers of a small artificial hill in Iraqi Kurdistan, and it tells us that the story of how civilization extended itself outward from its first cities was a story of human decisions, many at a time, in many places, made by communities whose names we will never recover. The Uruk expansion, however we understand its inner workings, did not last forever. By around 3100 before Christ, give or take a century depending on the site, something happens to the network. Many of the colonies in the upper Euphrates are abandoned. The contact sites in southeastern Anatolia decline or disappear. The southern-style enclaves embedded within northern Mesopotamian populations dissolve or are reabsorbed. The system of long-distance integration that had been building for at least 500 years, threading southern Mesopotamian material and administrative practices across thousands of kilometres, comes apart with surprising speed. The reasons for this collapse have been debated for 100 years, and are not, even now, fully resolved. There are several major hypotheses. None of them is mutually exclusive. The truth, as is so often the case in archaeology, is probably a combination of several at once. The first hypothesis is climatic. There is increasing evidence from paleoclimatic records, pollen cores, stable isotope analyses of cave deposits, lake sediments in nearby regions, that the late 4th millennium saw a period of climatic instability across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Prolonged drought or repeated drought episodes may have stressed the agricultural systems that supported the great southern cities. If yields fell across the alluvial plain, the surplus that funded the temples, the bureaucracy, the long-distance trade missions, and the support of distant colonies would have shrunk. The expansion was, in some sense, a luxury of abundance. When the abundance failed, the expansion contracted. The second hypothesis is political. The late Uruk period in the south appears, from what we can read of it, to have involved increasing competition between elites, possibly the emergence of more dynastic or kin-based forms of power, possibly conflict between the temple institutions and a rising secular leadership, possibly civil unrest of a kind that the system was not equipped to handle. The transition from the Uruk period to the subsequent Jemdet Nasr period, and then to the early dynastic period, was not a smooth one. The stone cone temple at Uruk's own Inana precinct was, according to the German excavators, destroyed by force in the Uruk 4B period, its contents formally interred in a separate building called the Riemchen building, in what looks very much like a deliberate ritual closure. There was conflict in the south. Conflict in the south meant disrupted networks across the wider system. The third hypothesis is one of internal exhaustion or rejection. Recent research at sites in the Zagros foothills, including the remarkable site of Shaki Kora in the lower Sirwan Upper Diyala Valley not far from Kanish, has suggested that some highland communities did not simply lose contact with the southern network because the south stopped sending people. Rather, they actively rejected the institutional forms that the network had carried. After participating in centralized institutions for centuries, these communities apparently chose to disperse, to return to smaller, less hierarchically organized settlement patterns, and to step back from the Uruk-style administrative practices. The collapse of the network on this reading was not just a withdrawal by the south, it was also a refusal by the highlands. The fourth hypothesis is one of network fragility. Long-distance economic systems depend on continuous flows of goods, people, and trust. When any of those flows is disrupted, by disease, by raiding, by the loss of a key node, by the collapse of a key institution, the whole network can begin to come apart in cascading fashion. Once the cascade begins, it is very difficult to stop. The Uruk expansion may have been more fragile than its impressive geographic reach suggested, and the events of the late 4th millennium may have simply pushed it past the threshold at which it could no longer sustain itself. Whatever the combination of causes, the result at Kanish was a fire and an ending. The late Uruk period level burned. The buildings collapsed or were demolished. The site, after a period of disuse, was eventually reoccupied, but the rebuilders were not building in the Uruk style. They were building in the styles that emerged in the 3rd millennium when the highlands and the south reorganized themselves into new patterns of culture and exchange. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the human meaning of this transition. Whoever stood in the temple at Kanish in its last decades was living through what they could not yet have known was the end of a world. They could not have known that the architectural traditions in which their building had been raised were about to fall out of use across the entire region. They could not have known that the long-distance trade routes they relied on would soon become harder to maintain, more dangerous to traverse, less lucrative to operate. They were inhabitants of a system in its final phase, performing their inherited rituals, marking their inherited documents, wearing their inherited gold, and then the system stopped. This is a recurrent pattern in human history. It is the pattern of every civilization's twilight. The people who actually lived through the late stages of an order, late Roman Britain, the last decades of the Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean, the dying years of the Minoan palace economy, usually do not understand in the moment what they are participating in. They are simply living their lives, with the assumptions that have always seemed reliable, and then one day the assumptions stop being reliable, and then there is silence, and then the next thing begins. The fire at Kanish may have been the moment when the silence arrived in this particular valley, or it may have been something else, a local accident, an isolated raid, a deliberate ritual destruction at the hands of the same community that had built the temple. We do not know yet. The continued excavation of the site, season by season, may eventually allow us to tell which version of the ending is the more accurate one. But in either case, the building was closed. The wall cones, having held their pattern through whatever ceremonies and offerings and seasons they were originally meant to witness, were buried beneath the collapse, and the gold, for some reason, whether dropped or deposited, whether forgotten or given, stayed where it was, sleeping in the upper layers of the mound for 50 centuries, until a Portuguese-led team in the autumn of 2025 lifted it back into daylight. It is worth returning once more to Uruk itself. The city did not die when the Uruk expansion contracted. Far from it. Uruk continued to be one of the most important cities of southern Mesopotamia for thousands of years after the 4th millennium. Its great temples were rebuilt and rededicated in the early dynastic period. The legendary king Gilgamesh, whose epic remains the oldest surviving long literary work in any language, ruled at Uruk according to Sumerian tradition in the 27th century before Christ. That is 400 to 500 years after the construction of the mountain temple at Kanish. The walls Gilgamesh is said to have built around the city are, in fact, archaeologically attested. Uruk was sacked, occupied, restored, rebuilt by Akkadians, by Ur III rulers, by Babylonians, by Assyrians, by Persians, by Seleucids, by Parthians. It was a city for thousands of years. Only in the early centuries of the Common Era did the shifting course of the Euphrates strand it from its water supply, and only by around 700 of our era was it finally and fully abandoned. But the late 4th millennium Uruk, the Uruk that built the cone-mosaic temples, that pioneered proto-cuneiform, that exported its style and its administrative apparatus across the highlands, was a particular phase in the long life of the city. It was the phase that produced the explosive cultural growth visible at Kanish. It was in some sense an extraordinary phase of any city in human history up to that point. A city that, within a few centuries, invented or perfected many of the foundational technologies of civilization simultaneously. Recent excavations at Uruk itself, conducted in 2025 alongside the Kanish work, have continued to add new dimensions to what we know about that early city. Production workshops have been uncovered in the broader urban landscape, confirming that Uruk was not only a religious and administrative centre, but also a centre of craft production. Irrigation canal systems have been traced more thoroughly across the surrounding plain. The picture is of a city more deeply enmeshed in its own region than even some older models suggested, with workshops and farms and water systems and warehouses operating at a scale that, in the late 4th millennium, was probably unique on Earth. This depth of integration helps to explain why a place like Kanish could exist. The city in the south was generating so much in the way of food surplus, manufactured goods, administrative innovation, and ideological power that its reach naturally extended outward. The reach was not military conquest. It was something stranger and more interesting, a reach by way of attraction, by way of trade, by way of the spread of practices that worked. The temple at Kanish is, in this picture, one of the small distant nodes that the gravitational pull of Uruk drew into orbit. It also helps to explain why the contraction of the late 4th millennium was so consequential. When the city began to falter, the gravitational pull weakened. The orbits decayed. The distant nodes began to wobble, some of them spinning out of the system, some of them remaining in place but ceasing to participate in the network. This is the moment we see at Kanish. The temple closes. The site eventually rebuilds itself, but in a new key. It belongs to a different age now. There is one more aspect of the building at Kanish that deserves attention before we close. It is not, strictly speaking, about Kanish itself. It is about what the architectural tradition that Kanish's temple participated in would eventually become. The cone-mosaic temples of late 4th millennium Uruk did not simply represent a stylistic preference. They represented an early phase of a tradition in monumental sacred architecture that would, over the following 2,000 years, evolve into what we now call the ziggurat, the great stepped temple platform that became one of the defining religious structures of Mesopotamian civilization. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, on which the White Temple stood, was already, in the late 4th millennium, an early version of the form. It was a multi-level platform raising the sanctuary above the surrounding plain, accessible by formal staircases oriented to the cardinal directions, designed to make the building of the god visible and approachable from a distance. As the centuries passed, this idea was refined and elaborated. The Sumerian and Akkadian rulers of the 3rd millennium expanded the platform tradition into more deliberately stepped, multi-tiered structures. The Ur-3 dynasty, around 2100 before Christ, built the great ziggurat of Ur, perhaps the most famous surviving example of the form, and a structure whose lower platform still stands today in southern Iraq. Restored in the 20th century, monumental even in its ruined state. The Babylonian dynasty produced the great ziggurat of Babylon itself, called Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth, a structure of multiple stages rising to a final sanctuary at the top, dedicated to Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. By the time the Greek and Roman geographers were describing Mesopotamia, these structures had become a defining feature of the civilization's identity. The biblical tradition preserves an echo of this architectural lineage in the story of the Tower of Babel, a structure in the city of Babylon that, according to the book of Genesis, was built by humanity in an attempt to reach the heavens, and that was confounded by God when the languages of its builders were divided. The Tower of Babel is, in the modern scholarly consensus, almost certainly a memory of a real architectural form. The great ziggurats, particularly Etemenanki, that dominated the urban landscape of late Mesopotamian cities. The story is not historical in the strict sense, but it is a memory of the impression these structures made on the peoples who encountered them, including the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, whose own religious architecture had nothing comparable. Now consider, the architectural language that would eventually evolve into the great ziggurats, and that would later be remembered in legend as the Tower of Babel, was being practiced, in its early phase, at Kanish. The tripartite floor plan, the cone mosaic decoration, the formal monumentality of the building, These are the early phase of the same broader tradition that would, over the following 2,000 years, produce the structures whose memory still echoes in the religious literature of the Western world. This is not to say that the building at Kanish was itself a ziggurat. It almost certainly was not. The platform tradition, as far as we can see, was a southern phenomenon in this period, attached to the great urban precincts of Uruk and Eridu. The mountain temple was a different scale of construction, but it was part of the same continuous architectural tradition. The cones pressed into the plaster of its walls were of the same family as the cones that would, in subsequent centuries, decorate the rebuilt and restored temples of southern Mesopotamia. The architectural vocabulary was shared, and this means that what was happening at Kanish was, in a quiet way, part of the foundational stream from which much of later religious architecture would flow. The mountain temple did not become a great ziggurat, but it stood at the headwaters of a tradition that would eventually produce them. It was a small piece of the early flowering of what would become, over the long arc of Mesopotamian history, one of the most distinctive architectural traditions in the ancient world. There is something humbling and a little vertiginous about the thought that a small building in a small valley in the Zagros foothills was participating, in 3300 before Christ, in a tradition whose distant descendants would still be remembered in the texts of three of the world's major religions 4,000 years later. The wall cones of Kanish can be understood as a kind of root system. The flowering they would eventually produce was Etemenanki, the great ziggurats of Ur and Borsippa, the legendary Tower of Babel. Those flowerings could not have happened without the long, patient establishment of the tradition in its formative centuries, and that formative establishment took place not only in the great precincts of Uruk itself, but also at small scattered nodes across the landscape, each of them participating in the language and contributing in its way to the language's eventual fluency. Before turning toward the final reflection, there is one thread we have followed only partially, and it is worth tracing more deliberately. We have spoken about the gold pendant in general terms, its rarity, its theological resonance, its association with status and the sacred. But we have not asked, with any precision, how a piece of gold actually came to rest in a building in the Zagros foothills, around 3200 before Christ. The question matters because the answer reveals, in concrete terms, how the network of which Kanish was part may actually have functioned. Gold, in the late 4th millennium, was sourced from a relatively small number of regions in the broader ancient Near East. The Egyptian Eastern Desert produced gold from alluvial deposits in dry stream beds and from primary deposits in the mountains east of the Nile. The Anatolian highlands, particularly in what is now eastern and central Turkey, held gold-bearing veins that would be exploited at increasing intensity during the 3rd millennium. The Iranian plateau, especially areas in what are now Iran's western and southwestern provinces, contained gold deposits that, based on what we know of regional metallurgy, were almost certainly being worked by local communities during this period. There may have been other sources further afield, possibly in the Caucasus, possibly in regions of Central Asia, that contributed material at smaller scales. For the gold to reach the Mesopotamian world, it had to travel. And travel, in this period, was almost entirely a matter of human and animal effort over land, supplemented by river travel, where rivers ran in convenient directions. There were no horses available for transport in 3300 before Christ. The horse had not yet been domesticated for that purpose. The donkey was the principal beast of burden, capable of carrying perhaps 80 kilograms across long distances under reasonable conditions. Caravans of donkeys, supervised by trained handlers, moved goods along established routes, stopping at known waypoints for water and food and rest. These caravans were vulnerable to weather, to terrain, to bandits, to the political turbulence of the regions they crossed. They required cooperation from local communities that controlled the waypoints, that provided shelter and supplies, that mediated conflicts, that took their cut of the goods passing through. A gold pendant arriving at Kanish around 3200 before Christ might have followed any of several paths. If the gold itself had originated in the Iranian highlands, it might have travelled westward along the foothills of the Zagros, passing through a series of communities like Kanish, before either continuing on toward the alluvial plain or stopping at some intermediate node where it would be reworked and redistributed. If it had come from Anatolia, it might have moved eastward along the upper Euphrates, southward into northern Mesopotamia, and then either eastward toward the Zagros or southward into the alluvium. If it had been worked in Uruk itself or one of the southern centres, then carried north as part of an outgoing exchange of finished goods for raw materials, the pendant might be a southern artefact making its way into the northern network, a piece of southern craftsmanship offered to a northern temple in some kind of interinstitutional gesture. The fragment that the team recovered does not, in itself, tell us which of these paths is most likely. The trace element analysis of the gold, which can sometimes identify the geological source of the metal based on the impurities present, is one of the kinds of follow-up scientific work that the project may undertake in the coming years. When that analysis is published, we will be in a much better position to say where the gold came from and, by implication, which segment of the network was most directly responsible for its journey to Kanish. But even without that future analysis, the basic picture is already informative. Whatever the specific source, the gold had to move along trade routes that were maintained by communities along their length. It had to be carried by people who knew the routes, who knew the languages of the communities they crossed, who had access to shelter and food and security at each waypoint. It had to arrive in a building that was, on the available evidence, a node of the same kind, a place where such goods could legitimately come to rest, where the people present had the authority to receive them, to record them, to incorporate them into the temple's holdings. The gold pendant, in other words, is not just a piece of jewellery. It is a piece of evidence about an entire economic and political infrastructure. To find it where it was found is to confirm, on the present interpretation, that the infrastructure existed, that it functioned, that it reached as far as Kanish, and that the people in Kanish were qualified to participate in it. This brings us back to one of the central insights the discovery is helping to drive. The communities of the late 4th millennium Highlands were not, in any meaningful sense, marginal to the early Bronze Age civilizational project. They were operational. They were the network. The system that allowed Uruk to access gold could not, on the most reasonable reconstruction, have functioned without them, and they could not have built temples in the southern style without the system that connected them to Uruk. The mountain temple was not at the edge of civilization. It was, on the evidence, one of the small but essential nodes through which civilization, in the late 4th millennium, actually moved. The Kanish Archaeological project has been working at the site for 13 years as of the time of this telling. 13 years is, by archaeological standards, neither very long nor very short. There are sites in Mesopotamia that have been under continuous excavation for more than a century. There are also sites that have produced extraordinary finds in their first season. 13 years is a normal middle distance. Long enough for a team to know the soil intimately, short enough that there are still entire areas of the mound that have not been opened. Most of Kanish has not been excavated. This is one of the most important things to keep in mind when we think about what the discovery of the temple-like building means. The team has opened a relatively small portion of the upper part of the mound, large enough to be confident in their interpretation of the building, small enough that there is no telling yet what else lies beneath the surface in the unopened sections. The mound is 3 hectares across. The main concentrated area is around 75 metres in diameter. Even within that smaller core, multiple excavation seasons would be required to fully expose the upper layers, and many seasons more to reach the deeper levels, the Chalcolithic and earlier deposits that lie at the bottom of the 15-metre accumulation. The team's preliminary report on the 2025 season is, as of late 2025, in preparation. The full publication of the first 3 excavation seasons is in the publication process. The detailed scientific analyses of the gold pendant, the cylinder seal, the cone mosaics, and the architectural plan of the building will appear in academic journals over the coming years. Each of these publications will likely contain additional information not yet available to the public, additional contextual nuances, additional cautions and caveats. It is also worth noting how recent it is that systematic international archaeology has been possible in Iraqi Kurdistan at all. For decades, the region was effectively closed to international fieldwork. The wars of the late 20th century, the political instability of the early 21st century, the regional conflicts that have continued to disrupt parts of Iraq, all of these made sustained excavation difficult or impossible. Only in the last 15 to 20 years has it been feasible for foreign teams to operate at sites like Kanish. The Kanish Archaeological project began in 2012 to 2013, in the relatively stable conditions that emerged in the Kurdistan region in the years after the Second Gulf War. It is part of a wave of international archaeology that has, for the first time in living memory, begun to systematically explore the foothills of the Zagros, the upper Tigris valleys, and the highland approaches to the Iranian plateau. What this means, practically, is that we are at the very beginning of understanding what is in this region. There are dozens, possibly hundreds, of unmapped or only superficially surveyed mounds across Iraqi Kurdistan and the surrounding territories. Each of them potentially contains layers from the late Chalcolithic period, the Uruk period, the early Bronze Age. Each of them potentially contains its own version of what Kanish has produced. Its own temple-like building, its own gold, its own cylinder seal, its own sequence of layered occupations stretching back 5,000 years or more. The discovery at Kanish is, in this sense, not just a single revelation, it is a kind of advance notice. It is plausibly the first signal of what an entire region is likely to produce when the ground is opened systematically over the coming decades. The questions it raises about how the Uruk network functioned, about who lived in these highland communities, about how the gold reached the temple, about why the temple closed in fire, about what was worshipped and what was traded and what was offered. Those questions cannot be fully answered by Kanish alone. They will be answered, if at all, by Kanish together with all the other sites that are yet to be excavated in this same landscape. Archaeology at its best is a slow art. It rewards patience. It rewards the willingness to return to a site for decades, to read its soil layer by layer, to publish its findings carefully, to revise its interpretations as new evidence accumulates. Some of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century were not made in spectacular single seasons, but over the course of multi-generational projects. The full meaning of Kanish, in the same way, will probably not be clear in any single year. It will emerge over the coming decades, as season after season is opened, as additional sites in the region are excavated, as the wider scholarly community absorbs the results and integrates them into the larger picture of late 4th millennium Mesopotamia. What we can say now, from the evidence currently available, is that the building uncovered in 2025 is one of the most significant discoveries of recent years in the Eastern Fertile Crescent. It will appear in textbooks. It will be cited in academic papers for decades. It will require revisions to existing models of the Uruk expansion. And it will, in due course, be joined by other discoveries from the same region, each contributing its own piece to a story that is still being assembled slowly, on the side of an artificial hill in a small valley between mountains. Imagine, as a closing exercise, that we could step into the building at Kanish at the height of its life. Picture the morning sun falling through whatever opening admitted light into the central hall. Picture the cones on the walls catching the light unevenly, the painted bases of black, white and red shimmering in the pattern that had been chosen for this place. Picture the smell of fresh plaster in the deeper layers of the wall. Picture the silence of the interior, broken occasionally by the sound of someone walking on the floor, or speaking in a language we no longer know, or pouring something into a vessel. We can imagine, based on what we know of the period, the cylinder seal hanging on a cord around someone's neck. The someone is wearing a robe, perhaps, made of woven wool, a fabric whose production was one of the great industries of the southern Mesopotamian world, and one of the goods that southern traders may have brought north in exchange for the metals and stones of the highlands. The robe is dyed, perhaps, with one of the few pigments available at this time and place. The cord around the neck is plain. The seal itself is heavy, of carved stone, with figures on it that this person could in some sense read with their fingertips before reading them with their eyes. We can imagine the gold pendant catching the light. We do not know where it sat, whether it hung from another cord, whether it was attached to a garment, whether it was placed on an altar or in a niche, whether it was held in the hand. But it was there. Somewhere in this building, in this hall, or in one of the smaller chambers, this small worked object of gold gleamed in whatever light reached it. The someone in the building may, in a real sense, have been a citizen of two worlds. They were of this place, these mountains, this valley, this small community of farmers and metalworkers and traders. And they were also of a much larger world, a world that extended from where they stood southward across hundreds of kilometres of plains and rivers, all the way to a city most of them may never have personally visited, but whose architectural style they had replicated here, whose administrative practices they had adopted here, whose gods possibly they had invited here. They were participants, on the most reasonable reading of the evidence, in an early long-distance civilizational network. They were, The evidence suggests nodes in the system that, at this very moment in history, was inventing many of the basic forms: writing, monumental religion, bureaucratic accounting, urban scale, that would define the next 5,000 years of human life. Then, at some point, perhaps gradually, perhaps in a single catastrophic season, the building closed, the fire came, or the hands of the community came, and the ceiling fell in, and the walls crumbled, and the cones broke, and the gold and the cylinder seal stayed where they had come to rest beneath the rubble. The ground levelled itself. New occupations came and went. The mound thickened by another layer, and another, and another. For 5,000 years the seal and the gold and the broken cones and the plan of the walls lay in their layer of compressed earth, while above them civilization after civilization passed. Akkadian, Assyrian, Hellenistic, Parthian, Sassanid, Abbasid, Ottoman, and modern Iraq was born, and the project of international archaeology became feasible in this region, and a team from Coimbra and Cambridge and Algarve and Suleymaniya opened the upper soil one summer and found them. This is the long arc of an archaeological discovery. It is not just the moment of finding, it is the moment of finding plus everything that came before it. The long, dark interval during which the objects waited in the ground for someone to come back. And it is the moment of finding plus everything that comes after. The analyses, the publications, the revisions of the textbooks, the slow integration of this single building into the larger story of how civilization began. Kanish has been part of that story all along. It has just been waiting in its valley in the foothills for the rest of us to catch up. There is a kind of question that archaeology can never fully answer, but that it raises continuously every time a discovery like the one at Kanish is made. The question is, what else is in the ground? We know about Kanish because a team chose to dig there, and because they had the time, the funding, the political stability, and the institutional support to keep coming back, year after year, for more than a decade. We do not know about the dozens of mounds in nearby valleys that have not been excavated. We do not know about the hundreds of mounds further afield in Iraqi Kurdistan, in northern Iraq, in the foothills on the Iranian side of the Zagros, in southeastern Turkey, in the Syrian Jazeera. Many of these mounds have been spotted from satellite imagery. Some have been briefly surveyed. Most have never been touched. Each of them is, potentially, a layered archive of human life going back thousands of years. Each of them potentially contains buildings with walls and rooms and objects and stories no living person knows. And what we have learned from Kanish, that the network of the world's first cities reached deep into the highlands, that ordinary mountain valleys could host extraordinary buildings, that gold and authority and architectural tradition could travel across hundreds of kilometres and embed themselves in places that look, from the outside, like nothing in particular. That lesson should reshape how we look at every other unexcavated mound in this region. Any of them could contain a building like the one at Kanish. Any of them could contain its own pendant, its own seal, its own quiet record of participation in one of the largest cultural projects of the late 4th millennium. The work of digging them up, of reading what is in them, will take generations. It will take peace. It will take continued investment in the careful, slow, patient labour of archaeology. But the material is there, in the ground, waiting. 5,000 years ago, in a small valley in the mountains of what is now Iraq, someone built a temple. They built it in the architectural language of the world's first city. They covered its walls with painted cones, set into wet plaster in geometric patterns. They held authority, the authority of the cylinder seal, the authority of the long-distance network. They had access to gold that came from somewhere in the highlands beyond their valley, somewhere their network reached but ours has not yet fully traced. They left the gold in the building. We do not know whether they meant to leave it, or whether they had no time to take it with them when the end came. We do not know what they prayed for in the central hall between the cone-encrusted walls. We do not know their names, and we never will. But we know this. Based on every piece of evidence so far recovered, they were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a network that stretched across the ancient world, that linked their small valley to the great city of Uruk on the southern plain, that carried the techniques of writing and accounting and sacred building across hundreds of kilometres of difficult terrain. They were not on the evidence at the edge of that network, watching from outside as civilization happened somewhere else. They were inside it, They were part of how it worked. The cradle of civilization was never a single city. It was a network. It was a web of mountain valleys and plain settlements and trade routes and temples, from Uruk in the south to Kanish in the north and beyond. The team at Kanish will return for the next season, and the next, and the next. There are more layers in the mound. There are more buildings that have not yet been opened. There are more objects that have not yet been recovered. There are more questions that have not yet been asked. The publication of the 2025 season's results, the full scientific analysis of the gold and the seal and the cones, the comparative work that will place this building in its broader context, all of that is still ahead. Other teams in other valleys are working their own mounds. The slow, patient work of opening the ground continues. What is in the soil of these mountains we do not yet know. We only know that there is something there, and that, every time someone takes the trouble to look, the picture of how civilization began grows a little larger, a little more complicated, a little more full of the small, brilliant, gold-flecked moments that happened in places we had not previously known to look. The mound at Kanish holds, somewhere in its remaining layers, the next part of the story, and it will be told in time by the people patient enough to lift it back into the light, brick by brick, cone by cone, across however many seasons it takes for the rest of the building to come back out of the ground. That story is just beginning.